Hi, and welcome to the Postmortem. Today we're going to be discussing Sega's curious Ooze-based action game, the Ooze. And with me to discuss it are...
I'm Bobiner, and I like this kind of thing unironically.
And I'm Carl.
Yeah, for all you know, we could all just be big blobs. Alien blobs.
I don't know about you guys, but I am a giant amorphous glowing blob.
So yes, the Ooze is a curious little late-gen release for the Sega Genesis. It was made by the Sega Technical Institute, which was established by Mark Cerny of, Marble Madness fame, I believe, in 1991. It was sort of created as a think tank or a talent factory for Sega of America that had near complete creative control. Like, there was zero executive meddling as far as I can tell. And a number of noted developers worked for this company, namely, as we noted, Mark Cerny, but also Yuji Naka, who actually split off from Sega of Japan to actually join the Sega Technical Institute after, after butting heads with some execs over Sonic.
Sega basically chewed out Yoji Naka for a few various things that occurred during the project. So he wasn't very happy that he had made Sega a humongous smash hit, and all they could do was bitch about the little things.
Yeah, I don't even believe he was paid very much for working on this game that made so much money for Sega.
I've read that he did get some bonuses related to development, but it wouldn't have been, an impressive number for a game that pretty much made Sega the company it was in the 90s.
Unfortunately, like so many similarly creatively focused companies before and since, they ultimately struggled to live up to their full potential. They only developed 3 or 4 games. They're probably most well known for Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which they worked alongside Sonic Team for that one. I believe it was co-developed.
Yeah, they basically shared creative staff and development duties. It's a very fascinating story if you have time to read up on it, since some of the English team members have done interviews about it in the past.
They also developed the heavily Mario-inspired platformer Kid Chameleon in '92. And then they followed that up with a odd Sonic spin-off known as Sonic Spinball, which is basically like pinball with Sonic physics level.
Well, I'd say it makes logical sense to make a Sonic pinball game, since you basically are a pinball.
Yeah, the problem, sadly, was I don't think Sonic Spinball ended up being that good.
It was kind of chunky.
It had a huge amount of potential, but it didn't really live up to it.
So, after they developed Sonic Spinball, things went a little bit quiet for a couple of years here. Until, I think, Sonic 3 and Sonic & Knuckles, they did some light work on that one, but they didn't do very much development work. And then
what's funny is that essentially the Japanese members of STI sort of branched off from the English-speaking members due to cultural and language differences. And so the Japanese members were heavily involved with Sonic 3 and Knuckles, but they were credited as part of Sonic Team.
And then in 1995, they finally released 2 games in the form of comics, and the somewhat more maligned and obscure game we'll be looking at today, the Ooze.
What is the Ooze, really? Well, how do you describe or define? They didn't really know how to market it, I think. The box is some of the most unironically terrible box art since Mega Man on the NES.
It's even worse if you're talking about the Japanese version.
It should also be noted that the cover art is very deceptive for the American release because it makes it seem like you're actually fighting against the Ooze rather than actually playing as the Ooze.
And that would have been a pretty cool game on its own if that was a real game. It's not, but I mean, kind of cool.
So I guess we could actually explain what this game is about by first describing the story. It's pretty much the most 90s thing ever, so I think that's pretty much Bob's realm of expertise there.
Well, you play as Dr. Kane, a scientist working for the corporation.
Yes!
That's the only name they ever get. Late at night, Dr. Kane is looking at the computer at some files or something, and it turns out the corporation is making the plague that they want to put in the water supply. And then the director finds out Dr. Kane's looking at his files, so he stabs him in the veins with this green goo, which turns him into some kind of weird goo creature that gets flushed down the toilet, and that's where the first stage starts.
And this sort of thing makes a lot of sense in response to, like Captain Planet. It's a very anti-establishment sort of tale.
It should be noted that the Japanese version is actually slightly different. I mean, there's a number of similarities there. You still have the corporation and Dr. Kane, discovering their terrible secret, but the motivations are slightly differently.
In the Japanese release, Dr. Kane is the one who actually invents the virus or the plague or whatever it is. Whereas in the English one, he's just kind of an idiot. He works for the corporation and doesn't realize that their enormous laboratories and huge expenditure in waste relocation is not suspicious at all.
These people make the Umbrella Corporation look subtle.
The Japanese manual is kind of interesting in that they actually have a girl in a bunny outfit there to explain the mechanics to you. There's also a random, really big buff naked guy in a hard hat that doesn't seem to serve any purpose as far as I could tell.
He's like just warning that it's a 0-rated game, I think it is.
That's how they warn you that this game has adult content, is by basically having a big muscular naked man tell that.
He's a naked man in a hard hat.
Yes, exactly.
Thing is, there's nothing really that objectionable in this game at all.
I think it's just very specifically the fact that you melt people in it. That's what my assumption is.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest issue there.
It's very cartoonified, which is why I don't... What was it? Probably like maybe PG outside of Japan?
Well, it's all cartoony and stuff. Like, I think the closest thing that you could compare this to would be a cartoon like either... Actually, yeah, you know what? This game is actually strangely trauma-esque, but as you noted, it's very PG, so it's comparable to the Toxic Crusaders cartoon or the Attack of the Killer Tomatoes cartoon.
For reference, I know this game ended up in some of the Sonic collections for the PS2 and GameCube, and I know those had an E rating, so yeah.
It's way less violent like Dragon's Lair or something, though.
Yeah, it really is, but it's still kind of horrifying in a way, because you do melt guys and they scream horrifically. So yeah, you know... This game, if you couldn't already tell, is pretty 90s, like offensively so. And nothing really communicates that better after reading the manual and getting all that backstory dumped on you than starting the game up and just hearing the main title theme, which is this really badass sort of like rock metal take on a B-movie theme or something.
I like the orchestra hits they put in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great music. It captures theme quite well. It doesn't sound like Ooze-ish, it's just like really cool.
It's just really the monster movie music, and I'd say that works.
Yeah, it does. One of the more rocking soundtracks on the Genesis, which is impressive because it's a lot of rocking soundtracks on the Genesis.
I really like the music. I know it's gems, the sort of music thing they generally make Western games with for the music, but I'd say they actually do a really good job with it.
Yeah, some great instrumentation or instrument choices, and it's just well composed in general. The thing to note about gems is that for those of you who aren't familiar with the Sega Genesis sound chip, is that it's an FM synth chip, whereas the SNES was sample-based. Like you could use samples, of like orchestra or something that sounds vaguely realistic. Whereas everything on the Genesis chip is actually generated by the chip itself. It's not playing the samples back to you.
The Genesis does have one single sample track.
It does, yes.
Although I think there's a rule about using it. You have to do something, like you can't use one other thing if you use the sample track.
I don't think you can use the PSG if you use the sample channel, maybe? So yeah, as a result, you pretty much had to program your own custom sound engine for the Genesis, and as a result, there were a lot of games that shared sound engines or instrument sets, and most notably in the United States, they used something known as GEM. But it's this generic set of instruments and samples that a lot of games use, and they don't really use it very well. They're kind of
It's not samples though; it's synthesized instrumentation, right?
I think it did have some samples in there, like maybe drum sets and stuff. Probably have been it, and that can even be faked using the noise channel on the PSG. Because the Genesis actually has two separate sound chips in it. It has the Yamaha 2612, and then it also has the sound chip from the Master System in it, which is kind of strange, but I think that was there for backwards compatibility reasons.
Even though it didn't have any backwards compatibility by default.
So yeah, that's a whole lot of junk just to explain why the soundtrack in this game sounds the way it does. But suffice to say, if you've ever played any other game that uses the gem system, it's probably going to sound like butt compared to the Ooze.
The Ooze and its sort of sister game, Comic Zones, are a couple of the only games that use gems that sound actually really good. I do think that's partially due to the fact that Howard Drossen, the musician behind it, seems to be a really competent guy. He still does music today.
I know he did the music for the Splatterhouse reboot, and some of that's really good.
Yeah, he did a bunch of stuff. He did Afro Samurai. He was involved in Giant Citizens Kabuto music.
Wow, really? Damn.
Yeah, he's listed as music director, I think, for that one. So I'm not sure what his role was. but he was involved in that game too. And he did some Dynamite Deca. He's done quite a few movie soundtracks as well. This is a pretty damn impressive resume from him.
So yeah, you got this rocking soundtrack, but there's this one song in particular. I believe it's Genetic Labs Areas 1 and 3? Or it's 1 and 2?
1 and 2, yeah.
And it's this really bizarre sort of metalish prog epic or something. Like, it's got these really curious elements to it, almost like a classical or romantic sort of sound to it. And I mean romantic in the age of music, not as in that, it's the music you listen to when you kiss people.
Yeah, they'll figure it out.
It's just very unusual. It's like this sort of rock ballad, and it's just really cool. You're going through these really clean labs, and the music is so foreboding.
The other thing about the soundtrack is that there's a couple of songs that aren't used, and that's a shame because those are quite good too.
One of which sounds like it was originally intended either to be music for the ending sequence or credits, or might have been exclusively for the good ending, which this game does in fact have, but we'll get to that later.
And about the game itself, what do you actually do in the Ooze?
Well, you would think that playing as a giant puddle would be pretty difficult, but they actually simplify the controls and actually make it pretty manageable. Controls are basically what you'd expect. You view the game from the top-down view, and moving left moves you left, up moves you up, right moves you right, down moves you down. So you move pretty much like any character in a top-down game. You also have access to 2 attacks. Namely, you can punch and you can spit. Now, spitting is about what you'd expect. It's a projectile attack. But where the game gets really interesting is with punching. You see, you're a big blob that has only his skull in his hands. And in order to attack, outside of projectiles, you can also punch enemies, which you can either tap the button to quickly shoot off a tendril of goo, or you can hold it down and actually guide it around corners to smack enemies in the face that you can't actually normally hit.
And the cool part about that is it's based on the size of the Ooze itself, the length that you can punch.
Yes, and that brings us to our next point. Outside of the controls, there's this odd sort of resource management element to the game. You see, since you're a big pile of goo, you don't have health in the traditional sense. Instead, you have this sort of buffer area of goo surrounding you, the Ooze itself, and that essentially is there to protect your head, which is the only part of your body that actually can take damage, sort of. It's actually very confusing.
The way the health system works in this game, it's almost like the anti-Sonic, like the Bizarro Sonic. That is, no matter how much health you have, for lack of a better word, you're always in danger of something instantly killing you, and if something hits your head, that's just it, you die.
Yeah, so it's goo that you have, or the Ooze itself, it just acts as a cushion for the character's head. It's very strange, and in fact, there's another element there that I noted earlier. It's sort of a risk-reward thing. I mean, I'm not sure that's the right term, but essentially, the bigger you are, the safer you are, but you also move very slowly, and you also leave a much larger trail of goo behind you that can easily be severed, bitten off, whatever. Conversely, if you're smaller, you're much more likely to die in a single hit, but you also move much more quickly, and there's no trail, essentially, so, there's no risk of something getting shot off. You either get hit and die, or you don't.
It's kind of cool, because the goo that gets shot off actually stays on the screen. It doesn't immediately disappear. You can reattach yourself to it.
And in fact, that brings us to the next point. All enemies in the game actually drop health. So there's actually an incentive to actually attack and kill things rather than necessarily run away, especially when you're really low on health. But there again, there's that danger there. You could die instantly if you're not careful, but you really desperately need the puddle of ooze that you'll leave behind for you. So you have to kind of weigh your options carefully when attacking.
And when you are attacking, spit actually consumes a small amount of your ooze.
Yes, so if you're too small, you have access to absolutely no projectile attacks, which can be very bad because that's actually that's the stronger of the 2 attacks, interestingly. Mostly because it's a health resource. It's health-limited resource. So you have this interesting sort of system built around the player character. I mean, you are basically a living pile of liquid. But the issue there is that they really don't do much with it. As noted earlier, instant death is pretty common. If something hits your head, say a blast of flame, it'll actually cut straight through you and then hit your head and you die. Or it's also possible to actually have your slime drained off into a drain or something, or even fall into one and just die instantly as you're just left with nothing but your head. And that leads to the next point. This game is way too hard. There is as noted, instant death is pretty common, and it's around just about every single corner after about the first world. First world's pretty gentle with you. It's got some tricky areas where you could die instantly, or an enemy might be able to kill you. or
Yeah.
either by cutting off all your ooze or just hitting you in the head.
The only thing you really have to worry in the first world is probably something like water, or maybe occasional flame jet. That's kind of it. Because
It's
water
funny
will
'cause-
freaking kill you if you get too close to it.
Well, it's because it's being like diluted, I assume.
It's actually quite rare to die by running out of ooze. At least in my case. I think it only happened maybe once or twice.
It depends. There's a lot of things that later on that will siphon off a lot of your ooze, leaving you in a very vulnerable state. But it's usually not you running out of ooze that gets you killed. It's usually something hitting your head. So yeah.
And the compounding the difficulty, because there is a very high difficulty in this game, you do not receive very many lives, and there are no continues and no passwords. Well, as Bob mentioned, the way the game works, you're pretty much vulnerable all the time. At no point do you really receive any sort of ability to have any strength. Like, there's a couple of power-ups in the game that we haven't mentioned. You've got a speed boost power-up and an instant kill power-up, which lets you kill enemies by touching them with your ooze, which is pretty cool, but you're always vulnerable to dying, and enemies are very fast and furious on executing their attacks. There's pretty much, from second or third world of the game's 5 stages, pretty much everything either cuts through your ooze very rapidly or can start attacking the edge of your ooze very quickly. And for some reason, and I can't really be sure why, if an enemy is attacking your ooze, you're not able to activate your punch or your spit. You have to move away from the enemy before you'll be able to do it. It sort of stun locks you in a way.
And this can happen even with the weakest enemy in the game. So if the weakest enemy in the game just crawls over, you have to crawl back to somewhere you can get even more damage, and that you just end up in a bad spot.
And
Yeah,
they
they can
definitely
push
use
you
that
right
to.
into a turret.
Yeah, they definitely use that to very punishing effect, starting in the second world, where there's often an enemy on one end, and then like a ramp that'll drop you into a drain or into a big pile of poisonous water or whatever.
There are some cool bits where you because you can use your punch to pick up power-ups and other things. So you can do really neat things where you punch around a corner to pick up something or attacking an enemy from safety. They did a little bit with the concept.
I would like to note that one element of this game that disappoints me is that there's that resource management system there with your ooze, but it's not really used for anything other than sort of an odd health/attack system. It would have been interesting if you actually had to build up enough slime to weigh down a grate or something. Or you had to siphon some off to fill up with some sort of machine, so you actually had a reason to attack everything, rather than just hopefully run past everything and not die.
Yeah, you never really feel that rewarded for maintaining size, and particularly later in the game, it feels a lot like the game's forcing you to be a certain size. You'll go through areas where there are drains, which you cannot avoid with any reasonable expectation. There's some cool little bits, you can punch these metal pylons, and then you'll transfer between one pylon and the other.
Yeah, and there are ramps, as noted earlier, which can prove difficult to climb up or to avoid falling down into, which is
The whole ramp thing, it actually gave me vague shades of Marble Madness, just for the ramps, nothing else. But that was it reminded me a little bit of that.
yeah, it's a nice touch, but it's not used very often.
All the stages have different gimmicks.
Yes.
It's got 5 stages, and they all have clear gimmicks in each stage to sort of give you a unique test on each stage.
They do a good job with that, I will admit, keeping things interesting.
And the aesthetic changes drastically too between all of the worlds. You start off in sort of this toxic waste dump. It's about what you'd expect. It's a bunch of toxic swamp water and burning barrels, flame jets.
That stage, because that is the 90s toxic waste dump. That's the exact style that any cartoon, if you said, we want a toxic waste dump, you would get that.
Yeah, it's concrete and metal and flame and toxic water and sheet metal. It's just really nasty looking.
Watch out for that flame, because if your head's over the top of it when it shoots out, you die.
Yes.
I do really love this game's style. I mean, everything about it's just so grody and grungy, and I actually really like that. It's a very unique look, and it's pretty much Sega peak 90s advertising.
Yeah, it's a very, very nasty looking game in a good way. It definitely wears its sort of theme, or it's sort of themed on its sleeve with pride. You can tell they had a lot of fun with this.
Very successful, yeah. What I really like about this game's style is it is gross and grody, but it's not as in your face about it as something like Boogerman.
Yeah, I would say that's true. Like, it's sort of got a pared down, I wouldn't say minimalist necessarily, but is there a sort of window dressing to enhance the game rather than building the entire game off of it in a sense?
Yeah, it doesn't feel like the game's trying to gross you out. It's just, this is what it looks like.
Now, I know, Cal, you were particularly floored by the animation of the, what was it, the evil bunnies, was it, in the bonus stage?
Yeah, in the bonus stages. They're so great! They, like, have this fairly long attack animation where they try and bite you. Compared to most of the other enemies in the game that just kind of wobble a bit when they get on top of you, the bunnies try and rip pieces out of the ooze. When they die, they like leap into the air and then collapse into a skeleton. Really cool stuff with the animation, and I really like the ooze himself. They gave him plenty of good Sega charm. He laughs when he's moving around. During his idle animation, he can sometimes duck into his ooze, which doesn't let you actually avoid projectiles or anything, but he just seems like he's having so much fun being the ooze. It's really cool, and when he dies, he screams like really loudly and then like melts into the puddle.
Yeah, he does that sort of cartoon thing where he like, there's just a split moment where he's still hanging on and he's just looking at it and she's like, man, you really screwed up, and then he just collapses and dies, pretty much.
And then a toilet flushes, what I think is a nice touch.
Literally going down the drain. But yeah, going back a little bit to the level design, sometimes the aesthetic can actually make progressing a little bit confusing, because I know in a few instances there are actually like things like teleporters that you simply cannot see, and there's other invisible elements like switches and stuff like they're just hidden under things that you kind of have to poke around to find.
For the most part, this stuff is all optional. You know, there's bonus stages that are hidden, which you have to actually just bump a random spot on the map and you'll go to the rabbits. And you can sometimes find teleporters that give you extra ooze pickups or some extra power-ups, or sometimes lives. But on the Power Core 3, which is a boss stage for the Power Core, there is a hidden teleporter which is mandatory to finish the level. And I know personally myself, and I know Snarboo as well, we explored this level trying to work out what the hell we were supposed to do. Eventually we just had to check a let's play of it to find out what you were meant to do. And in a completely nonchalant spot of the level that is no different or indicated in any way, there's an invisible teleporter that you have to hit to get through the level. And you can't just touch it with your ooze, you have to physically bump the head of the ooze to use teleporters.
Otherwise, though, the levels are pretty standard linear levels with some side pathing and, you know, little bits and extras to explore, as well as a ton of locked doors and switches to hit.
They're not strictly linear, but you often have doors locked off and stuff just to make sure that you're following roughly where you're supposed to go. But there's usually side paths that have minor rewards if you go on them, or other enemies and stuff.
Speaking of minor rewards, this game does something for, I guess, extra replay value that I didn't really enjoy.
Oh yes, we didn't mention that, did we?
No one enjoys what they added to this.
Alright, so, like I said, the plot is you get turned into an ooze puddle. But for some reason, Dr. Kane's DNA is, like, lying all over everything the corporation has. And there are 50 of these things in the game, like 10 per world, I believe.
Actually, I seem to remember reading I forget if it was a speedrun guide or something on it. Apparently, all of the DNA strands you absolutely have to collect to beat the game aren't actually in the stages. Only some of the stages actually have all 10 that you need. In other cases, you actually have to bump into secret areas to find the bonus stages to collect the rest of the DNA pieces. And you can't miss a single one of these.
With 10 bonus DNAs in them.
Yeah, you cannot miss a single one of those bonus stages.
And it is a really disappointing bonus.
The thing you get is only very slightly different. The manual itself says that finding all the DNA makes the game more fun. The manual lies.
It does, because here's what happens. You basically, okay, so you don't get all the DNA. Here's what happens. You get a screen of the ooze being the ooze, and then the game ends. You get the credits, whatever. If you get all 10 of them, he actually starts going back into a man, a very ooze, goo-shaped man, but a man nonetheless. And then again, you get the credits. That's it.
They did that because they didn't want to show him without pants.
Yeah, I assume that's all. Yeah, I assume, but it's still weird that he only barely regains his humanity. Like, he's still like basically the ooze forever. He's just like more human shape now. So the game's got a rocking soundtrack, and in terms of sound, it's well executed, but nothing really special. I mean, you've got about all the sound effects you'd expect. I mean, you have a spitting sound effect for when the ooze spits. You have a roaring sound when he gets hit. Some of the enemies have like interesting sounds, like biting sounds or like weird sort of skittering sounds for like, I think some of the creatures in this game make really weird noises. I don't know. They're just weird animal noises. You've got gunshot effects, and you also have the most horrifying like sample of someone like being melted into goo I've ever heard. It's just horrifying. Like you're killing these dudes in suits. I mean, they're burning you to death half the time, but then like you're like punching the crap out of them, and then they melt, and they're like, oh!
When you're punching him, we didn't mention this, but sometimes you actually drag people towards your ooze, which seems random when it does it, and it's kind of cool, but then to make the game even harder, later on enemies actually explode, and if you pull them towards yourself via, you don't have any idea why it does it, you can blow yourself up by punching people!
And boy, is that fun. It's not like that didn't happen to me like 10 or 20 times as I was trying to actually play this game.
There is one particular thing of the graphics design I really like. There is, at no point, any kind of HUD in the game, so the only way you can see how you're doing is looking at your ooze on the actual screen. And I think that's interesting. It kind of reminds me of, like, Out of This World, actually.
Or later games such as Dead Space, which actually did sort of cheat a little bit by having the HUD on the character himself and have it also pop up out of his visor, but still, same sort of idea.
And Trespasser.
Oh, that's right, which has the world's first and probably only boob-based health bar.
The way the ooze does its health bar, by the way, because it does do it, if you're very low on ooze, the ooze starts flashing red, and it makes this really annoying noise. Ugh. Oh, and the options menu itself doesn't have, like, much in the way of text either. It's actually, you control the ooze, and you just alter some options in there, that's cool.
Yeah, it's like you're in some sort of... That's probably one of the more interesting things about the game is that element right there, they could have easily taken that out of the options menu and actually put it in the game as a, an interesting puzzle series or something, which they didn't, but, whatever.
I think that there might be maybe a possible reason there is so little text in this game, because the story's all done with the pictures, and like the only text is like names of levels and how many lives you have left between when you die.
Which are gigantic. It's absolutely huge.
And they're spelt with the actual ooze the ooze liquid engine as well, which is pretty cool too.
So, what I think happened is, supposedly this game is supposed to be a launch title for the Nomad, which was basically a portable Genesis. I think they must have anticipated that might have been hard to read small text on a screen like that, so they used very little text and just made all the text that was there very large.
And yeah, it has been confirmed that there were talks to put this game as a launch pack-in title for the Nomad, but it didn't eventuate.
Yeah, it's like they forgot that they actually had this game in development for the Nomad, and then they just kind of launched it without the game, and they're like, oh, whoops, sorry guys.
Which seriously sounds like that's what happened.
That wouldn't surprise me either, given some of Sega's dubious, shall we say, tactics towards the end of the 16-bit gen. They weren't even really tactics, they were more like blunders, but that's a topic for another day.
Right, well, regardless of the game's dubious quality and completely out-of-line difficulty, it's at least a fairly interesting game, and high difficulty didn't impact the sales of a lot of other 4th-gen titles like Echo the Dolphin, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, or something like ActRaiser 2. 1995 was pretty late for a Mega Drive title though, and the game's notoriety seems to reflect a lack of sales. The Japanese version is especially quite rare. So what factors likely contributed to the weak reception, considering it received fairly acceptable scores from reviewers at the time? 6 out of 10s and some 7 out of 10s. It was average thoroughly.
Well, there's a very simple answer to that question. 1995 was the year the PlayStation debuted, at least in the States. I believe it was 94 in Japan. Now, granted, this was before, I don't know how many people remember this, but there was this period of time when after the PlayStation launched, I'd say maybe a year or two afterwards, where 2D all but died out, and like 2D was seen as this sort of retro bygone, BS sort of stuff. No one wanted a 2D game. So it was a little bit before the sort of push back against 2D games, or the sort of negative reception to old 2D games. They were considered sort of retro bygone, no one wanted to bother with these old 2D games. They wanted 3D because that's the future. So 2D games pretty much all but died out. But as noted, the Ooze predated that. So the only likely theory we have about this, or the only one I have in any case, is that just the sheer hype from the PlayStation was more than enough to basically kill off everything that came before. It didn't even have to look old or retro. It just wasn't the PlayStation.
I wouldn't say the Genesis was dead just yet, as the PlayStation was still kind of getting its early legs. But I could see that maybe people were probably switching over to it. I mean, trying to think about how many big-name games were for the Genesis 95.
Vector
Maybe
Man was one, I think, wasn't it?
That and Rise Star and, what else?
Well, other than Comic Zone itself, because that was
also received kind of mediocrely.
I think that Comic Zone received actual praise, though. I think that one scored.
It
quite
did, yes. Yeah, Red Zone did actually come out. That was either late '94 or early '95, I think. And you had Adventures of Batman and Robin, which was either late '94 or early '95.
There's a lot of strong games. I mean, maybe that could have been part of it. I think there were some really great games that came out at the same time as the Ooze that weren't completely full of bullshit.
So yeah, that's actually probably, you know what, that's actually probably the best theory going there, is that you had this launch of this new platform that was really starting to pick up steam, where it was just, just sheer hype. It was like this avalanche, it just hit. And then you have all these other games coming out for the Genesis that are much more approachable, have very high production values, and are just so much more approachable than the Ooze.
And I guess we can't underestimate how the box art is for the Ooze.
Yeah, I remember seeing the box art for this in a magazine or something once, and I had never seen it in stores, and I just remember seeing this in 95, 96 or so. I was like, what is this game? This looks so weird. Like, I have no idea what this is. Like, and I meant that's dumb. I meant that's kind of dumb to say given cover art from the 90s. We all know how goofy that could be.
Well, I mean, if you compare it to some of the other box art examples on the Mega Drive and, of course, on the SNES, it looks really cheap. Like, it really looks like a knockoff box. Like, someone has just gotten their kid nephew to spray, like, airbrush the thing. Looks like fan art.
I mean, granted, it sort of fits the game's aesthetic here of being really grody and sort of very, like, B-movie-esque. Like, that's the kind of a B-movie poster right there in a lot of ways.
I do like the box. I think it's a really nice looking thing, but I know that if I had have seen it in 95 alongside of the really cool box art that you got, I don't think anyone would have picked it up, because it just looks kind of cheap.
It does a little, and it's confusing too, because like I said, all I had to go off was just the front cover of the box. I couldn't tell if it was like some sort of weird, I think my original theory was it was a strategy game or something, like you had to fight the Ooze or something, like you had to like command this team of guys or to do it, which could have been an interesting alternate game mode, I suppose. But
well, you were the one that recommended that we play the Ooze for the post-mortem. And even when you recommended it and I started looking at the just screenshots and stuff, I was just thinking, what do you do in this game? What is your goal?
It's funny. I think this was the first game I ever emulated for the Genesis, or one of the first, because I just had no idea what it was. I was just kind of floored when I loaded up Genesis in late 99 or so, whenever it was that I first started getting into Genesis emulation, and just seeing this sort of weird game play out. It's like, man, this is so weird but kind of cool. I'm kind of sad I didn't know about it then I thought back and I was like, well, I didn't have any idea what it was in the first place. I literally had to basically play the game secondhand to basically know what this thing was.
Yeah, and part of the charm of the game is in its overall presentation. I don't think it looks good in screenshots very much.
Yeah, you need to kind of have the movement of the blob itself. You need to see how he moves and flows throughout the stages, and how the enemies interact with your character too, to sort of get a feel.
Yeah, because the way the algorithm works, it looks really cool in motion. I mean, you can see the seams of how it's functioning, but it's a really, really, really cool effect, and I like it a lot.
This is one of the very few Genesis games that actually has actual physics to it, and I think that's really kind of neat.
Besides Pugsy.
How it works is that the Ooze is basically just like a ton of small sprites put together, right?
Yes, and that's something only the Genesis could really do, because it was much less restrictive than the SNES when it came to sprites, I believe. The SNES had very hard limitations, I believe, on sprite size.
Yeah, if you want a quick explanation of the way sprite restrictions work, can't remember the exact ratios, but essentially at any time the SNES could only display 2 different sprite sizes. So it was something like the SNES could have 16 by 16 and 32 by 32 sprites, and that was all it could have on screen at any one time. Whereas the Genesis was free to pick and choose out of any of its available sprite sets. So it had more flexible sprite sizes as well. It could do rectangles and squares, whereas the SNES I think could only do squares. But this meant that you could make the Ooze up of lots of 4x4, 8x8, or whatever size the Ooze's individual segments are made out of. But then you could use much larger sprites to represent enemies, or ground or environment, which meant that you could make much more efficient use of your sprites, and you were able to subdivide the ooze into his size.
So we have this unusual game for the Genesis. No one probably knew what it was at the time, and those that had played it were probably even more confused. I mean, trying to explain this game has been very difficult, but are there literally any games ever out there that play like this game does? Like, that have anything in common, either in terms of having a heavy emphasis on fluid physics, or maybe even just sort of odd, gooey physics in general? I mean, in terms of perspective, you obviously have other top-down games like the Chaos Engine. I meant, not quite the same thing, but it's got a similar look and feel to it.
But the Chaos Engine, it has two-player co-op, which I think is probably the main reason that the Chaos Engine was as successful as it was. The fact that the Ooze, it really couldn't do two-player, I don't think it would be physically possible. But that might have let it down as well, the fact that it was a strictly single-player experience.
I could think of a few games that involve blobbish creatures. There's Gish, that's a similar idea, but not quite.
Gish is probably one of the closer indie games. There's another game called, I believe, that was by the same people that did Guacamelee, called Mutant Blobs from Space. Something like that. And then there's another indie game, which is strictly a puzzle game involving water physics, called Puddle. And those three games are probably the closest. Like, Gish definitely feels like a platformer take. Like, it feels like they took someone took Mario and then, like, tried to remake it as the Ooze or something.
The thing about Puddle is it actually has liquid physics, which is the main reason it's similar. You actually get broken up and you actually do find water and that sort of thing. It's 2D side-on, but Puddle actually, it's much more modern. I think it was 2012, I want to say, maybe early 2013, but whatever the case is, it actually uses the physics that it can, so it actually has puzzles that relate to, being frozen and moving around in certain ways, I believe. So it actually is more of a puzzler than an action game. I can't think of a game that feels really like the same thing as the Ooze. Like, you control an amorphous blob that is kind of an action game as well. There's a couple of games that sort of have liquid-based characters. There's an indie game that's existed for ages called Liquid Wars, where you actually control Liquid in a sort of tug-of-war setting. That's a bit of an odd one.
What was that one that was released on Steam recently, Cal? I saw you commenting on. It was a strategy game with heavy emphasis on physics, or liquid physics. And it looked like the exact opposite of the Ooze. Like, it was the strategy version of the Ooze.
Yeah, I remember the name now. Yeah, that one is a Creeper World. And that's kind of like a tower defense game, where you also have this big, basically ooze that sort of fills up the stage, and you have machines and things that can manipulate that, and your goal is to sort of force that into your opponents, but also to convert it to your side. These are all games that sort of have liquid and fluidish sort of gimmicks to them, but again, none of them really feel really that close to the Ooze. They're just they use liquid as a similar sort of thing. I think Perimeter 2 also has some usage of water in it.
It's definitely a heavy game. It has a heavy emphasis on terraforming. I know that about Perimeter. I always was curious about those games, but I never could find a copy. I mean, nowadays it's on It's on GOG and Steam, so
yeah,
that's worth checking out.
I definitely recommend Perimeter.
You have games that are thematically, I guess, similar in terms of like being these odd collectathons with weird physics emphasis. Like, I mean, you have Katamari Damacy, and then you have De Blob, which De Blob is vaguely similar, kinda, not really. I mean, you got the blobby character, but it's more of a traditional platformer, but it also has a heavy emphasis on collecting things and, converting things and kind of using the weird blob mechanics in an interesting way, so that might be worth looking into.
Also, there's a couple of other little indie games. It's interesting, I think it's mostly indie games that have experimented with this sort of thing. But Kenta Cho, who's kind of he's like almost a savant in a way. He makes some very conceptually interesting shmups and arcade-style games. He did one called Tumeki Fighter. That one, you control a little biplane, but when you kill enemies, you can attach them to yourself, and then that turns you into a more powerful ship. That one has a similar sort of convert your enemies into your own stuff feel to it, so it's got like a little bit of that going on. I also think that I think Cactus actually made this one. It was called Clean Asia. I think one of the ship mechanics in that had you collecting lots of little bits and pieces to increase your firepower.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that. But, you know, this just seems like an idea that the indie developers would go crazy for. Like, it's a nice showcase of tech being applied to game design in a way that's very unique and interesting. Like, there's so much more you could do with the Ooze. Like, as I said, like, you could have to get them certain size to weigh things down. You could have to siphon off parts to fill up, like, say, a meter before you can open a door. You could even do, like, sort of almost like a split screen thing where you have to split into two smaller ooze piles and like have to navigate them separately, or even in sort of a limited co-op fashion. Like, there's just so many crazy things you can do, and nowadays there are like, you have like access to ready-made physics engines that can probably do what this does with minimal effort. I mean, as long as you can know how to drop it into whatever environment you're programming your game in.
Overall, this game, it does feel like this is something that STI, they were really forward-thinking with a lot of their processes and the stuff that they actually managed to release. Had some really novel ideas and execution in it, because I know Comic Zone has, like, just a huge amount of little features in it that...
That's another one that's never been redone. I mean, you've seen games with sort of a similar comic book feel. Beautiful Joe notably.
Maybe 13.
Notably.
Would that count?
Yeah, 13 would probably count in some ways. That one also has some interesting crossover between being like a comic book and also, you know, having gameplay elements that borrow from comic themes, such as being able to see enemies walk because you see like their onomatopoeias, like, or sound effects pop out of their like feet or whatever when they're walking. That was actually a clever little game.
The thing about the Ooze specifically, the tech couldn't handle the ideas that you would need to execute to make it a really good game.
It's kind of
I'd love to
disappointing in
see
a way.
indie developers or something tackle this game.
There's so much they could probably do with it and to expand upon it, and you could even do like different perspectives on different... You could change the gravity, you could have it be different perspectives for different levels. You could just make it a plain old platformer. You could do other things too. Actually, there's an indie game in development. I forget what the name of it is though. I think you're some sort of giant growing fungus thing though, and it's got some interesting sort of similar...
When we had discussed this game before recording, there were a couple of little things that we thought could have been changed to the game that would have improved it dramatically. And I feel like we might just want to mention those things specifically, because there's basically two things that I thought really needed to be changed in the game.
I can name one right off the bat. There's a power-up that speeds you up, but there is no independent run button in this game. And that's really strange to me because it only uses 2 of the 3 buttons on the Genesis pad. There's absolutely no reason you couldn't have had a button to speed the Ooze up at the risk of like maybe having parts of them detach, you know, if you go too fast, or... It's just strange to me. It just feels like there's something missing there, like in terms of movement, because you're kind of the slow, tanky sort of blob for most of the game, unless you lose most of your Ooze and then are reduced to like running around the level trying not to die in a single hit.
Basically, the other thing that really needed addressing was maybe you shouldn't have died so easily. Really, that's the thing about this game. I think that it was rushed in places. It has all of the symptoms of a game that was rushed out the door.
It really does. The difficulty, most notably, some of the levels feel like the hazards they've been placed in there have been done so haphazardly because, like, they maybe had a skeleton of a level and they didn't know what to do with it, but they couldn't obviously throw it out because they need this game out now, so they just added a bunch of hazards to it. And this is especially noticeable in later stages where it's like almost impossible to navigate these stages because it's like one huge hazard after another that's just out to kill you.
It's like they didn't do a final pass on half the levels, and some of the checkpoints feel very arbitrary in their placement. Just like there's unusually large gaps between some checkpoints, and other checkpoints are almost right next to each other.
The way the checkpoints work is kind of weird too, because they take into account everything you did before you hit the checkpoint. So sometimes you'll hit one before you probably should have hit it.
Yeah, it's poor placement because there's checkpoints on the wrong side of a door that you need to open. So you accidentally hit the checkpoint, then you have to go through and unlock the door, and then you can't re-hit the checkpoint. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a few songs in the sound test that don't show up anywhere else in the game, and that's usually a pretty good indicator that something has been cut.
Maybe there's just one place to put it? I don't know.
That's the thing, if you're going to make a game, you generally will pitch the amount of levels and the amount of music that you'll need. You don't make excessive amount of music because that's, you know, extra time, extra development work for something that you will not actually use. I don't know, it seems like the Ooze was rushed out, and I think it makes sense because it was released kind of late 95, mid-late 95. To me, that says that they were just thinking, oh no, the Saturn's right around the corner. We have to finish the Ooze because it's kind of done, and we just need to release it at this point so we can get on with production of no more games. So aside from seemingly missing some content, it looks like STI did have vague plans for an Ooze sequel, as apparently the lead programmer did convert the Ooze liquid physicsy sort of thing for use on the Saturn. I don't know if a tech for that has ever actually seen the light of day, but that's what I've read, is that they did have vague plans to get that going. Didn't eventuate on anything, as well. STI really, they peaked more or less.
Yeah, it's kind of disappointing because like translating something like that to 3D must have been hell, like really hard to do, because I can't imagine how hard it was to do in 2 dimensions.
Especially when you're setting a beat for the Saturn, which is not great for 3D, as we all know.
It's more how it renders graphics, actually. That's a story for another day. Okay, so this is going to be pretty tricky to rate, especially for a game from 1995. So, do you think this Ooze would have stood a better chance now as opposed to then, or do you think it's a game that could have only existed in the 90s?
Well, I feel like the magazine reviews at the time were honestly fairly spot on with the Ooze for the most part. It's a really novel concept, and I could see that if you were willing to give it a chance, you'd be pretty impressed by what they did. It was pretty fun. But it has crippling difficulty problems. It has a level select, so you can at least go through the whole game without getting completely bogged down, but it is just way too punishing. If I was reviewing it for 1995 release, honestly, I'm pretty sure I would have given it probably a 6 out of 10. I really wish I could grade it higher, but it's so frustrating. Like, if we weren't doing this specifically to break down the game and sort of take it apart, I know I would have quit before I would have gotten too far in it, because it's such a frustrating experience to see it reach as far as it does and then crash down. If it was sort of released today, I don't know, I think that it would fare almost as well. Extreme difficulties, it's not hugely different. It does have a sort of Dark Souls difficulty to it. Very punishing, very hard, but for the most part, it's pretty fair about what it does. If it kills you, it's usually, you'll see the enemy, you'll see them fire at you, and then you don't dodge in time, or you thought you could dodge and you didn't. So I'd give it a 6 out of 10 as well for a modern game.
I'm gonna agree with Cal here. A 6, maybe a 7 with an extra point just for the uniqueness of the concept. As you said, it's a very difficult game. It's pretty brutal, and you have to play the game again and again if you want to get anywhere. I don't like that a lot. They could have done a lot with the concept, and I appreciate that they had such a great idea. Just actually playing this idea doesn't always work, because the game is so damn hard. As for a more modern release, I think with a more modern physics engine, maybe some more puzzles and such that work with that kind of thing, I think you'd have something really good on your hands, but you really have to tweak the difficulty. Like, this could make like a great action puzzle game if you worked at it. So let's give it a 6.
That's 6, a 666, alright.
I am actually going to break the trend here and say that if, let's say I'm a reviewer in 1995, I probably would have been a lot harsher on this game than you guys would have been, because I probably wouldn't have known what to do with the Ooze exactly, because it's got this great look to it, it's got this great aesthetic, great music, all this other stuff. It definitely works thematically, but in terms of control and difficulty, I probably would have rated it a 5 out of 10, mostly because it's very difficult. There are other games that are just actually better than this coming out around the same time. I mean, you have the PlayStation, of all things. It would sort of be hard to care about this game, especially when, you know, it's being buried under so many other games and releases and all this hype that's just surrounding, you know, the launch of the next gen systems. So I probably would have just said, you know, it's an okay game, you'll probably have some fun with it, but it's probably just a rental. So again, 5 out of 10. For a more modern review, however, I would actually probably give it a 7 out of 10. And the reason for that is because it's an incredibly clever game. It has done something that very few, if any, other games have done. And if this had been an indie release that had come out, either for free or about $10, whatever, I probably would have been enamored with it, because it's just such a bizarre concept. Like, it's so cool and so interesting. Like, how often do you see a game where you actually control a sentient pile of liquid? I mean, there's maybe 2 or 3 other games that do this, but they don't do it the way the Ooze does. I mean, it's got this attitude to it. It has this really great grungy look. It knows it's sort of this weird little oddball, and it loves it. And it's just, you can't help but love it too.
Honestly, all issues included, I still really like this game. If it wasn't so brutal and buggy in places, it'd be an absolute classic. Still, it almost certainly deserves more recognition than it's gotten, so I'd recommend giving it a play. But that's me, and I'm willing to overlook a lot of problems if the core idea is interesting enough. What about you guys?
I eat up Russian FPS games for breakfast, so you should know my answer by now. That is to say that yes, I definitely think this game is just, it shouldn't have been overlooked. It needed a lot of polishing to make it into a much better game, but it's on its own, it's just interesting enough to play through at least once, or to just experience it.
I agree. It's a game that definitely hasn't been done on the Genesis. For sure has not been done on the Super Nintendo, and hasn't really been done ever since. And even if it's hard, it can be fun if you can get past the crushing difficulty level. So it definitely is worth trying, even if you're probably never going to get anywhere, let's be honest.
So the story of STI itself continued for a few short years without them ever finishing another game. They assisted AM1 with the development of Die Hard Arcade, before self-destructing during the tortured production cycle of Sonic Extreme.
So that's a wrap for the post-mortem. As usual, if you like what you see, be sure to follow us on Twitter and to rate and subscribe to our videos on YouTube. Or join us next time as we take on a city under siege.